It all started in the middle of one of those blistering summer weeks where the air seems to shimmer from the heat rising off the pavement, and the neighborhood where I lived had grown tense because of one particular resident who everyone quietly referred to as HOA Karen, a woman who seemed to thrive off nitpicking, reporting, and enforcing rules that weren't even in the handbook, always lurking with a camera phone in hand and a notebook she carried like it was the constitution of the subdivision. She had already fined my neighbors for leaving trash cans out for more than 15 minutes, scolded children for riding bikes on the sidewalk, and even complained to the HOA board about holiday decorations being too flashy. But my situation with her escalated far beyond the normal neighborly disputes because she seemed to take a particular dislike to me after I adopted Rex, my retired military canine German shepherd who had served 3 tours overseas before coming into my care. And while Rex was loyal, disciplined, and incredibly well trained, to Karen he was nothing more than a menace she claimed barked too loudly, even though he rarely did unless someone was trespassing. So it wasn't surprising that she began filing bogus noise complaints and scribbling warnings on my door about leash violations, despite the fact that Rex was always on one. Still, what truly tipped things into dangerous territory was when I finally called her out during an HOA meeting after she tried to push a new rule banning aggressive breeds, which was a thinly veiled attempt to force me to give up Rex. And I stood up and reminded everyone that Rex had literally served his country, was decorated for service, and had better discipline than half the people in the room. A statement that made most of the neighbors laugh and applaud, but left Karen fuming red as if steam was about to shoot out of her ears. And from that day forward, I could feel her eyes on me every time I stepped outside, her curtains twitching whenever Rex and I went on walks, and though I tried to ignore her passive-aggressive stares and her constant whispering to other neighbors, I could tell she was planning something because people like her don't take public humiliation lightly. Little did I know just how far she would go until the weekend. I had to leave town for a family gathering, a 2-day trip I had been planning for months, and while I usually took Rex with me on road trips, this time my cousin asked me to come without him because their toddler was still nervous around big dogs, so I decided to leave Rex at home since he was perfectly comfortable there with an automatic feeder, plenty of water, and security cameras that I monitored through my phone. And besides, Rex wasn't just any dog, he was trained for patrol, detection, and protection, meaning my home couldn't have been safer. But I made the mistake of underestimating just how obsessive and bold Karen could be, because while I was away, she must have been watching, waiting for me to leave, and she seized the opportunity to cross the line from petty harassment into criminal trespassing by sneaking into my house under the assumption that Rex was gone too, though how she thought that, or what exactly she planned to do inside my home, remains a mystery. Whether she wanted to snoop for imagined HOA violations, plant something incriminating, or maybe just prove some twisted point about my dangerous dog. But what she didn't anticipate was that Rex was very much inside, alert and waiting, and unlike a normal pet who might cower or wag its tail, Rex followed his training to the letter. He detected an intruder, assessed the threat, and engaged in a way that would leave Karen with a lesson she'd never forget. Later, when I pieced together everything from the security footage, the audio recordings, and the testimony she herself blurted out while trying to spin the situation, I realized the sheer recklessness of her actions and how much worse it could have ended, because Rex could have treated her as an enemy combatant instead of a nosy neighbor. But even in that heated moment, he showed more restraint than she ever did, holding her in place, barking with the force of a lion's roar, his teeth bared just inches from her arm until she froze in terror, unable to move, as though she had finally realized she wasn't in control of this neighborhood, not anymore, and certainly not inside my house, and that was only the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the entire HOA, make the evening news, and end with the police escorting Karen out of my property while Rex stood guard like the hero he had always been, watching silently as if to say, "You should have known better." The first notification I received that something was wrong came not from the police or a neighbor, but from my home security app, which pinged me while I was sitting at my cousin's dinner table, a cheerful family gathering that instantly soured when my phone buzzed with the alert motion detected. Living room. And my first thought was confusion, because no one should have been inside, the doors were locked, the alarm armed, and the only living soul supposed to be there was Rex. Yet when I pulled, up the live feed on my phone, I saw the blurry figure of a woman slipping through the side door, glancing nervously around as if she expected to find hidden treasures or damning evidence. And then the image cleared enough for me to recognize her unmistakable poofy blonde hair and oversized sunglasses, Karen, in all her entitled glory, creeping through my home as though she had the right. But before I could even process my fury, the camera caught Rex in the frame, ears pricked, body low, moving, with a precision that only years of military training could give. And in that instant, I relaxed ever so slightly because I knew my boy would handle it, though my hands were shaking as I whispered, "Get her, Rex," even though he couldn't hear me through the screen. And what followed was both terrifying and oddly satisfying because Rex didn't just lunge recklessly like some untrained guard dog. He stalked her, every muscle taut, waiting for the exact moment when she reached for the handle of my bedroom door. And then he exploded into motion, his deep bark blasting through the speakers so loudly that my cousin's toddler burst into tears while Karen screamed and stumbled backward, her purse flying open as receipts, coupons, and a notebook spilled onto my carpet. But Rex wasn't interested in her belongings. He was focused solely on neutralizing the intruder, circling her with a predator's patience, barking with sharp bursts that forced her against the wall, and I could see the sheer terror in her face even through the grainy feed as she raised her arms like someone about to be arrested, crying out, "Don't bite me! Don't bite me!" As if Rex could be reasoned with, but his training wasn't about biting indiscriminately, it was about control, about intimidation, about holding a suspect in place until his handler arrived, and that's exactly what he did, standing tall and rigid just feet from her, lips curled back enough to display his teeth while his eyes stayed locked on hers, a warning that said if she moved 1 inch the wrong way, she'd regret it. And I sat there helpless, yet oddly vindicated, torn between calling the police immediately and savoring the poetic justice of Karen finally facing the consequences of her endless meddling. But practicality won out, and I dialed 911, explaining in clipped words that my neighbor had broken into my home and that my service-trained K9 had her contained, and the dispatcher, after confirming the address, assured me officers were on their way, though she paused when I mentioned the dog and asked, "Is anyone in danger of being bitten?" To which I answered honestly, "Only if she moves," because I trusted Rex completely. He had dealt with worse situations overseas and always showed restraint unless given a direct command. But still, my heart raced as the minutes dragged, watching Karen's bravado crumble into whimpering tears as she stood trapped in my living room, her phone clutched in her trembling hands as she tried to dial someone, maybe her husband, maybe even the HOA president. But Rex growled low in his throat, and she dropped it. In panic, her voice echoing through my speakers as she wailed, "Call him off! Call him off!" Even though she knew I wasn't there. And perhaps the most ironic part was that she had spent months trying to label Rex as dangerous, unruly, a threat to the neighborhood. And here he was proving he was the opposite, disciplined, restrained, doing his job exactly as he was trained, while she was the one violating the law and common decency by invading someone's private home, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride mixed with rage as I watched the flashing lights finally appear in the driveway. 20 minutes later, the officers approaching cautiously until they saw through the glass door, Rex standing like a sentinel, his body still between Karen and any possible escape, and they moved quickly, guns lowered but hands ready, shouting for Karen to put her hands up, which she did instantly, babbling incoherently about how the dog tried to kill her, and she was just checking for violations. Her excuses tumbling over themselves in desperation, but the officers ignored her protests and ordered Rex to stand down, though he didn't move until I, through the two-way audio on my phone, gave the command, "Stand down, Rex, good boy, sit," and like the soldier he had always been, he obeyed immediately, sitting calmly at attention as the officers stepped inside, cuffed Karen, and read her rights. The entire scene surreal as my family sat around me in stunned silence, my cousin muttering, "What kind of neighborhood do you even live in?" while I tried to catch my breath, knowing this incident wasn't just a one-off stunt, but the culmination of Karen's obsession with control. And though she was being led out of my home in handcuffs that night, a small part of me already suspected she would try to spin the story, paint herself as the victim, and rally the HOA into some ridiculous crusade against me and Rex because people like her never admit fault, never take responsibility, and never back down quietly. But as I watched Rex tilt his head at the officers, calm and loyal even after the chaos, I swore to myself that no matter what storm Karen tried to kick up next, I wasn't going to let her win. The morning after Karen was escorted out of my house in handcuffs, I woke up to a flood of notifications, texts, and voicemails that confirmed my suspicions. Karen was already working overtime to rewrite the story, to paint herself not as the trespasser caught red-handed by my cameras and neutralized by my canine, but as a misunderstood neighbor checking for safety violations who was unfairly attacked by what she dramatically described as a military killing machine. And while the footage clearly showed her sneaking in, rifling through my belongings, and being contained by Rex without a single bite, she conveniently left those details out when she blasted her version across the HOA's Facebook group, emailed the board with a 3-page rant, and even called the local news to claim she had been nearly mauled inside her own neighborhood, which might have been laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous, because lies have a way of spreading faster than truth when they're dressed in panic and exaggeration. And soon enough, neighbors were messaging me asking why Rex had attacked her, whether I'd be forced to remove him, whether the HOA could mandate his removal. And though many people privately sided with me, especially those who had their own horror stories about Karen's meddling, the noise she created was impossible to ignore. And sure enough, by the end of the week, an emergency HOA meeting was called to discuss the recent incident, which everyone knew was code for Karen versus Rex Round 2. So I arrived early, armed not with weapons, but with a USB stick containing every minute of the security footage, multiple witness statements from the police, and Rex himself, who I deliberately brought to sit calmly by my side, not because he needed to intimidate anyone, but because his quiet presence would say more than 1,000 arguments ever could. When Karen strutted into the room, still wearing a wrist brace and dramatically limping like she had barely survived a war zone, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing because Rex hadn't even touched her. Yet here she was playing the victim with the theatrical flair of someone auditioning for a soap opera, and as she launched into her tirade, wagging her finger and shrieking about how my vicious beast had nearly ended her life, I simply waited, letting her dig the hole deeper until the board members began exchanging skeptical glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, because they all knew Karen's reputation for exaggeration, but still she had influence, and I could feel the tension in the room as she demanded that Rex be removed from the neighborhood for everyone's safety, and that's when I stood up wordless at first and simply plugged in the USB stick, projecting the footage onto the screen behind me. The room went utterly silent as the video played, showing Karen sneaking through my side door, rummaging nervously in her purse, and then freezing in. Terror as Rex stepped into view, barking, circling, but never once making contact, never once lunging or biting, simply holding her until the police arrived, and the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The whispers began, a few chuckles even broke out, and Karen's face went from triumphant red to pale, white as her narrative collapsed in real time, though she tried desperately to interject with "that's not what it looks like," and "the angle makes it seem worse," but no one was buying it, especially when the footage ended with her screaming about violations and being allowed to check for safety, words that made her sound less like a concerned neighbor and more like a burglar caught in the act. And then I spoke, calmly but firmly, explaining that Rex had served overseas, that he was decorated, disciplined, and had shown remarkable restraint, pointing out that any untrained dog would have bitten her instantly for invading its territory, while Rex had done nothing but hold her in place until law enforcement arrived. And I reminded them all that if it hadn't been for him, who knew what she might have planted or stolen inside my home, because the real danger that night hadn't been Rex. It had been Karen, her obsession, and her willingness to break the law just to harass someone she didn't like. When I finished, Rex, almost on cue, laid his head on my knee and sighed, and I swear half the room melted, because it's hard to call a dog a killer when he looks like the picture of calm loyalty. And while most of the board seemed swayed, Karen wasn't finished. She doubled down, accusing me of manipulating the footage, claiming the police were biased, and even threatening to sue both me and the HOA if they didn't act against Rex, her voice shrill and desperate as she realized the ground beneath her was crumbling. But the board chair finally cut her off, slamming a gavel and declaring that the matter was closed, that no action would be taken against Rex because there was no evidence of aggression, and instead the issue of Karen's trespassing would be referred to the HOA's legal counsel, a statement that made her sputter like a tea kettle about to boil over. But the meeting adjourned before she could claw back control, leaving her fuming while neighbors quietly approached me to shake my hand, pet Rex, and whisper their thanks for standing up to her. And though I left that night feeling victorious, I knew deep down Karen wasn't done because people like her don't accept defeat gracefully. They regroup, they scheme, they find new ways to lash out, and sure enough, in the days that followed, I noticed odd things happening around my house. Trash mysteriously appearing on my lawn, anonymous complaints filed with animal control, flyers about dangerous dogs, taped to mailboxes, all petty, cowardly attempts to stir trouble, and while I brushed them off at first, a growing unease told me that Karen wasn't just angry, she was desperate and desperate. People can be dangerous, especially when they feel cornered. And I had no idea that the next move she made would push everything to the brink of a legal and personal war that would make the entire neighborhood choose sides once and for all. In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, I realized that while the board had shut Karen down publicly behind the scenes, she was still trying to wage her private war against me and Rex, escalating from petty nuisances to outright dangerous behavior. And it all came to a head one late Friday night when I was sitting on my back porch with Rex at my feet, enjoying the quiet hum of crickets and the cool breeze, when suddenly Rex stiffened, his ears shooting up, body tense, his nose pointed, toward the fence line, and I knew instantly that something was wrong, because Rex didn't react to raccoons or squirrels like that. His body language was different, focused, alert in the way I had seen him in old footage from his military days, and within seconds the motion lights snapped on, illuminating the shadowy figure of Karen crouched near my shed, fumbling with something in her hands that glittered metallic under the floodlights, and before I could even shout, Rex let out a thunderous bark that made her flinch and drop whatever she was holding, which I later discovered was a can of rat poison pellets, likely intended for Rex's food bowl, a revelation that still makes my blood boil. But in that moment I was running, shouting, "What the hell are you doing on my property?" While Rex surged forward, stopping only at my sharp command, his body forming a living wall between me and Karen, who scrambled backward against the fence, her face pale and wild-eyed, muttering some nonsense about neighborhood safety and dangerous animals, even as the evidence of her intent lay spilled on the ground, gleaming like deadly confetti under the lights, and I realized this was no longer about HOA fines or petty harassment. This was about her obsession crossing into criminal insanity, and I wasn't about to let her walk away this time, so I pulled out my phone, started recording, and called 911 while keeping Rex steady, his low growls rumbling like distant thunder as Karen tried to stammer excuses, first denying it, then blaming me, then finally shrieking about how the board didn't listen and how someone had to protect the neighborhood, her words unraveling into a frenzy that only highlighted how unhinged she had become. And when the police arrived minutes later, Rex didn't move an inch, holding his ground until I gave the release command, at which point he calmly sat beside me as though nothing had happened, his eyes still locked on Karen like a silent judge, and the officers wasted no time collecting the spilled poison, photographing the scene, and handcuffing her again. Though this time the charges were far more serious: attempted animal cruelty, trespassing, harassment, and even reckless endangerment, because if that poison had been left in the open, not just Rex, but any neighborhood pet, or even a child could have been harmed. And as she screamed at the officers to let her explain, they shoved her into the back of the cruiser, her voice echoing through the night like the pathetic wail of someone who had finally run out of lies to hide behind. The trial that followed months later was the final nail in the coffin of Karen's reign of terror, because the evidence was overwhelming: the footage from my security cameras, the audio from my porch recording, the physical bag of rat poison with her fingerprints, and even testimony from other neighbors who admitted she had tried to recruit them into signing petitions against Rex. And though her Lawyer tried to spin it as a moment of poor judgment. The jury wasn't buying it, convicting her on multiple counts, and the judge, perhaps fed up with people like her wasting court time, handed down a stiff sentence of probation, community service, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order that barred her from coming within 500 feet of me or Rex, which effectively ended her meddling days in the neighborhood. The HOA, embarrassed by the scandal and the publicity it brought, quietly removed her from the board and rewrote several of their policies to prevent individuals from abusing power in the future, a move that restored some balance and peace to the community. But the real victory for me was personal, knowing that Rex, my loyal partner, had not only protected my home, but had also been the reason the truth came to light time and time again. And in the months after the dust settled, I noticed how differently my neighbors treated him, no longer wary of his size or his past, but respectful, even admiring, children asking if they could pet him, families inviting us on walks, people nodding with gratitude when they saw him patrol our yard like the guardian he was. And I realized that in the end, Karen's obsession had backfired spectacularly, turning Rex into a local hero and exposing her as the dangerous one all along. Sometimes I sit on that same back porch with Rex at my feet, the sun setting behind the trees, and I think about how close it came to disaster, how easily things could have gone the other way if Rex hadn't been so disciplined, if I hadn't had the cameras rolling, if the law hadn't stepped in when it did. But then Rex will nudge my hand with his cold nose, reminding me he's still here, still watching, still loyal, and I'll laugh and scratch behind his ears, telling him he's the best partner I could ever ask for, because at the end of the day, this wasn't just a story about an HOA Karen gone rogue. It was a story about trust, loyalty, and the bond between a man and his dog that no amount of lies, harassment, or poison could ever break.